April 29th, 1945, shortly after dawn, the SS officers commanding the defensive perimeter around Moosburg, Germany, surveyed their positions with the grim satisfaction of men who had prepared for exactly this moment. Behind them lay Stalag VII-A, Germany's largest prisoner of war camp, holding 110,000 Allied soldiers from every nation fighting the Reich. Before them lay open fields, a single road from the northwest, and the Amper River crossing that any attacking force would have to use. They had machine guns dug into positions along the railroad embankment. They had infantry in foxholes covering the approaches. They had the desperate courage of men who knew the war was lost, but intended to make the Americans pay for every meter of German soil. The intelligence reports indicated an American armored force approaching from Ingolstadt, but the SS had stopped armor before. They had stopped it at Arnhem. They had stopped it in the Ardennes. One more river crossing, one more defensive stand, one more chance to prove that German soldiers did not simply surrender because the situation appeared hopeless. What the SS defenders did not know was that the American force bearing down on them had already raced 50 miles in a single day, crushing resistance that was supposed to slow them for weeks. They did not know that the men in those approaching Sherman tanks had liberated another prison camp just 3 weeks earlier and understood exactly what was at stake. And they certainly did not know that within hours, 5 Americans with a single mounted machine gun would drive directly into the heart of their largest prisoner of war camp and accept the surrender of 240 armed German guards without firing a single shot. The liberation of Stalag VII-A would become the largest single rescue of Allied prisoners of war in the entire European theatre. It would free more Americans in one morning than some divisions captured Germans in entire campaigns. And it would demonstrate, in the war's final days, that American armor had become an instrument of such speed, aggression, and calculated audacity that even elite SS formations could not comprehend what was happening until it was already over. This is the story of how 1,750 Americans of the 14th Armored Division shattered German defenses, rejected a Nazi truce proposal with contempt, and crashed through the wire fences of Germany's largest prison camp to free 110,000 men from over a dozen nations. It is a story of American tactical brilliance, individual courage under impossible circumstances, and the kind of bold leadership that the German military, for all its vaunted professionalism, never quite learned to counter. The 14th Armored Division had crossed the Rhine River in late March 1945 as part of the massive Allied offensive into the German heartland. Designated the Liberators, a name they would earn many times over in the war's final months, the division had proven itself across the battlefields of France and into the Reich itself. By late April, they were deep in Bavaria, part of General George Patton's Third Army, racing to close the door on what remained of Hitler's crumbling empire. The division was commanded by Major General Albert C. Smith, a career armor officer who understood that speed and aggression won battles while hesitation cost lives. Under his command, the 14th had developed a reputation for rapid advances that kept German defenders perpetually off balance and prevented them from establishing the kind of prepared defensive lines that could slow an armored thrust. On April 28th, the division crossed the Danube River at Ingolstadt, passing through the 86th Infantry Division, which had established a bridgehead the previous day. Their mission was straightforward on paper, but enormously complex in execution. They were to secure crossings of the Isar River at 2 critical points, Moosburg and Landshut. These river crossings were essential for the continued Allied advance into southern Germany and Austria. Every hour of delay meant more time for German forces to escape southward, more time for the enemy to establish new defensive positions in the Alps, and more time for the war to continue claiming lives on both sides. Combat Command A, under the leadership of Brigadier General Charles H. Karlstad, drew the assignment of seizing Moosburg. The force was significant, but not overwhelming. The 47th Tank Battalion provided the armoured punch, its M4 Shermans crewed by men who had fought their way across Europe and knew exactly how to employ their vehicles in both open terrain and urban environments. The 500th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion offered fire support with their self-propelled howitzers, though circumstances would prevent them from using that firepower when it was needed most. D Troop of the 94th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron provided scouting capability, racing ahead of the main force to identify enemy positions and routes of advance. C Company of the 125th Armored Engineer Battalion stood ready to deal with obstacles, demolitions, and the inevitable destroyed bridges that German forces left in their wake. B Company of the 68th Armored Infantry Battalion provided the infantry component, the foot soldiers who would have to clear buildings, root out defenders from prepared positions, and hold ground that the tanks seized. And B Battery of the 398th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion added additional firepower with their automatic weapons. In total, Combat Command A numbered approximately 1,750 men and officers. German intelligence officers who reviewed the composition of the American force would have noted a critical weakness that their defensive doctrine was designed to exploit. With only one company of infantry, Combat Command A was significantly under strength for the kind of house-to-house fighting that taking a defended town typically required. Armor without adequate infantry support was vulnerable in urban terrain, where defenders could use buildings for cover and concealment, engage tanks at close range with Panzerfausts and magnetic mines, and isolate individual vehicles from their supporting elements. A conventional military assessment would have concluded that Combat Command A needed substantial reinforcement before attempting to seize a defended town and river crossing against determined opposition. But Brigadier General Karlstad was not planning a conventional attack, and the Germans would soon discover that American armor did not wait for conditions to become optimal. German forces in the area included remnants of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division and the 719th Infantry Division. These were not fresh formations at full strength. The 17th SS had been mauled repeatedly during the Allied advance through France and Germany, losing vehicles, heavy weapons, and irreplaceable veteran soldiers at every engagement. The division that had once terrorized French civilians during the Normandy campaign was now a shadow of its former strength, its surviving members fighting as infantry rather than the mechanized force they had been. The 719th was a static defense division that had been swept up in the general retreat, soldiers who had expected to spend the war in garrison duty now forced into mobile combat. They were neither trained nor equipped to conduct, but they were still dangerous. SS troops in particular had a reputation for fanatical resistance, fighting to the death even when the tactical situation was hopeless. Many of them believed the propaganda that surrender meant execution or torture at Allied hands. Others were true believers in National Socialism, who preferred death to defeat. They had weapons, ammunition, and defensive positions. They knew American armor was approaching, and they intended to make the crossing of the Isar River as costly as possible for the soldiers of the 14th Armored Division. What the German commanders did not know, and could not have calculated using their established doctrines, was how completely irrelevant their preparations would prove against the speed and audacity of the American advance. Combat Command A covered nearly 50 miles on April 28th, against sporadic resistance that never had time to coalesce into organized defense. German units attempting to establish blocking positions found American armor was already past them before their defensive preparations were complete. Roadblocks that should have delayed the advance for hours were brushed aside in minutes. Rearguard detachments that expected to slow the Americans long enough for the main body to escape found themselves surrounded and captured before they could withdraw. By 2300 hours, Combat Command A headquarters had established itself at Puttenhausen. The main striking force, including the 47th Tank Battalion and the infantry of B Company, 68th Armored Infantry Battalion, was 8 miles to the southeast at Mauern, only 4 miles from Moosburg itself. The entry into Mauern had not been easy. Just before midnight, the infantry moved ahead of the tanks to clear the town, standard procedure for urban operations where tanks needed protection from close-range anti-tank weapons. They walked into an ambush. SS soldiers with machine guns and automatic anti-aircraft guns had positioned themselves in buildings overlooking the main approaches. The first bursts of fire caught the lead elements in the open, and men went down before they could find cover. The fight that followed was intense but brief, American firepower and the aggressive tactics that had carried the division across France overwhelmed the defenders. Riflemen worked through the buildings systematically, while tanks provided suppressive fire against identified enemy positions. B Company lost several men before the town was secured, their bodies the price of clearing another German-held town in the endless advance toward the heart of the Reich. But by midnight, Mauern was in American hands. German defenders at Moosburg received reports of the American arrival at Mauern with something approaching disbelief. The Americans had covered 50 miles in a single day, shattering the timetable that German planners had assumed would give them days to prepare defenses. They were now only 4 miles from the Isar River crossing. The elaborate defensive preparations that were supposed to buy time for organized resistance, for the evacuation of critical supplies and personnel, for the movement of the prisoner population if necessary, had been rendered meaningless by the sheer speed of the American advance. German staff officers who had confidently predicted that the Americans would take 3 or 4 days to reach Moosburg were forced to revise their estimates, but even their revised estimates would prove wildly optimistic. During the early morning hours of April 29th, a car approached a roadblock on the southeast side of Mauern from the direction of Moosburg. American sentries, alert for exactly this kind of approach after the ambush they had survived hours earlier, tracked the vehicle through their sights. But the car was flying a white flag, and the sentries held their fire. Inside were 4 men who requested, in formal terms, to speak with a senior American officer. They were escorted to Lieutenant Colonel James W. Lann, the commanding officer of the 47th Tank Battalion. The delegation was unusual in its composition. It included a representative of the Swiss Red Cross, present to lend an air of neutrality to the proceedings. There was an SS major, representing the German military command in the area, and there were 2 Allied officers who had travelled from behind German lines to participate in this meeting, Colonel Paul S. Good of the United States Army, and Group Captain Willits of the Royal Air Force. Good and Willits were the senior American and British officers from Stalag VII-A, the prisoner of war camp near Moosburg. Colonel Good had a distinguished record before his capture. He had commanded the 175th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division during the Normandy campaign. His regiment had been part of the force that stormed Omaha Beach on D-Day, suffering terrible casualties in the initial assault, but ultimately securing a foothold that would lead to the liberation of France. Good himself had been captured on June 13, 1944, during the vicious fighting around Carentan. He had spent nearly 11 months as a prisoner, watching the war progress through scraps of news that filtered into the camp while he waited for the rescue that seemed perpetually delayed. The SS major carried a written proposal from the German area commander. After a brief discussion at the roadblock, Lieutenant Colonel Lann made a decision. This was above his authority. He escorted the group to Puttenhausen to meet with Brigadier General Karlstad. Major Daniel Gentry, Combat Command A's intelligence officer, was on duty in the command post when Lieutenant Colonel Lann arrived with the delegation. Lann went inside first, leaving the delegates waiting outside in the pre-dawn darkness, and informed Major Gentry about the unusual visitors. Brigadier General Karlstad had just awakened and would be in the command post shortly. Within minutes, the general walked in and received Lann's report before the delegation was admitted. When the delegation was brought into the command post, shortly before 0600 hours, something unexpected happened. Colonel Good and Brigadier General Karlstad looked at each other, and instant recognition crossed both faces. They knew each other. They were old friends from before the war, from the small world of career army officers who had served together at various posts during the lean interwar years. They greeted each other warmly, using first names, while the rest of the officers in the command post looked on in surprise. The SS major's carefully prepared diplomatic approach had just encountered a personal connection that transcended the formality of the proceedings. Major Gentry was struck by Colonel Good's appearance. His jacket was the wrong colour, some ersatz material that had been substituted when his original uniform wore out. The fabric was coarse wool, poorly tailored, nothing like the standard-issue clothing an American officer would normally wear. The rest of his uniform was badly worn, patched and repatched, showing nearly a year of wear without proper replacement. He wore a single insignia of rank pinned to his collar, crudely cut from what appeared to be a piece of tin, the improvised marking of a man determined to maintain his military bearing despite the conditions of captivity. Nearly 11 months of imprisonment had reduced an American regimental commander to a man in threadbare clothes wearing homemade rank insignia. In stark contrast, Group Captain Willets's uniform was in excellent condition. His buttons were polished. His insignia was proper. He carried an officer's swagger stick, the traditional accoutrement of British military leadership. The British officer corps, even in captivity, apparently maintained its standards of dress and bearing. The comparison between the two senior officers spoke volumes about the different conditions American and British prisoners had endured, though both men had been held in the same camp. The German proposal was written in English, presumably to ensure the Allied representatives could read it clearly. It called for an armistice in the area around Moosburg, citing the presence of the large prisoner of war camp as justification. The proposal expressed concern for the welfare of the prisoners, suggesting that combat operations in the immediate vicinity would place them at risk. It further proposed the creation of a neutral zone surrounding the town. Under this arrangement, all movement of Allied troops in the vicinity would cease, while representatives of the Allied and German governments conferred on the proper disposition of the prisoners. Prior to this moment, no one in the 14th Armoured Division had known there was a prison camp at Moosburg, much less that it was Germany's largest facility for holding Allied prisoners. The intelligence about Stalag VII-A had not filtered down to divisional level, or if it had, no one had connected the camp's location with the immediate tactical situation. Combat Command A had been focused on river crossings, not prisoner rescues. But Brigadier General Karlstad immediately recognized what the German proposal actually represented beneath its humanitarian language. Accepting the armistice would prevent Combat Command A from capturing the bridge across the Isar River, which lay within the proposed neutral zone. The Germans would gain time, perhaps days, while diplomats and senior commanders discussed the situation. In those days, retreating German forces would escape across the river. The Isar crossing would eventually be destroyed or rendered useless. The advance toward southern Germany and Austria would be delayed, and the Germans would have the opportunity to move at least some of the Allied prisoners with them, using 110,000 men as human shields or bargaining chips as the Reich collapsed into chaos. The proposal was clever. It was even reasonable from a certain perspective. But Brigadier General Karlstad was not in the business of considering German perspectives. He sent a radio message to division headquarters at Manching, requesting instructions from Major General Smith. The response came quickly and left no room for interpretation. Major General Smith rejected the German proposal entirely. He added a demand for the unconditional surrender of all German troops at Moosburg. No neutral zone, no armistice, no negotiations about the disposition of prisoners, surrender or be destroyed. Brigadier General Karlstad relayed the response to the SS Major with evident satisfaction. He did not issue a deadline by which the German commander must respond. He did not make allowances for the delegation to return and discuss the rejection with their superiors. He did not give the Germans any opportunity to delay the attack while they considered their options or formulated a counter-proposal. The delegation left to return to Moosburg. Before they were out of sight, Karlstad was issuing orders for the attack to proceed immediately. German officers who had drafted the truce proposal and hoped it would buy them precious time discovered that American commanders operated on a different timeline entirely. The SS had perhaps 2 hours, at most, to prepare for an assault they had expected to negotiate away. In his message ordering the rejection of the German proposal, Major General Smith had included an unusual instruction for Brigadier General Karlstad. He ordered him to lead your troops into Moosburg. The wording was atypical. Smith did not normally phrase orders to his subordinate commanders in such personal terms. A standard order would have simply directed Combat Command A to seize Moosburg. The specific injunction to lead the troops himself was something different. There was some discussion in the command post about what exactly the division commander intended. Some officers thought Smith was merely emphasizing the importance of the mission. Others wondered if there was a specific concern about the prisoner situation that required a general officer's presence. Brigadier General Karlstad concluded that his superior meant exactly what he said. Karlstad was to personally lead the attack. It was a bold interpretation. General officers did not typically place themselves at the front of armoured assaults. Their role was to command from positions where they could receive reports, issue orders, and coordinate the actions of multiple units. A general killed or wounded at the head of an attack left his command without leadership at a critical moment. Standard doctrine was unambiguous about keeping senior officers away from direct contact with the enemy. But Brigadier General Karlstad was not a standard general officer, and the 14th Armoured Division was not a standard division. Karlstad climbed into his jeep, accompanied by his aide, 2nd Lieutenant William J. Hodges. 1st Lieutenant John Sawyer of D Troop, 94th Cavalry Squadron, joined them as guide and additional eyes. The small party drove to Mauern, where Karlstad linked up with Lieutenant Colonel Lann at the 47th Tank Battalion headquarters. Together, the commanding general and the tank battalion commander would move with the lead elements in the attack on Moosburg. There was no discussion about making the prison camp a specific objective. Combat Command A would continue with its primary mission of seizing the Isar River crossing. The rescue of the Allied prisoners would happen as a natural consequence of taking Moosburg. The men of the 14th Armoured Division had done this before. 3 weeks earlier, they had fought their way into Hammelburg to liberate Stalag 13C, freeing American prisoners who had been held since the disastrous campaign in North Africa. They understood what was at stake when American soldiers were held behind enemy lines. They needed no special instructions about the importance of reaching those men before the Germans could move them elsewhere, or, in the chaos of defeat, do something far worse. As soon as units were in position, Combat Command A attacked down the main road between Mauern and Moosburg. The infantry platoons of B Company, 68th Armoured Infantry Battalion, were attached to the tank companies for the assault, dispersed among the armoured vehicles to provide protection against close-range anti-tank weapons and to clear obstacles that might block the tank's advance. C Company of the 47th Tank Battalion led the advance, its Shermans grinding forward with the 2nd Platoon of the infantry riding on their decks and following close behind. Behind them came B Company of the 47th, with A Company in support, ready to exploit any breakthrough or reinforce any element that encountered heavy resistance. Simultaneously, a platoon of tanks and a platoon of infantry executed a flanking maneuver on the right of the main axis of attack. This secondary thrust would prevent the Germans from concentrating their defensive forces against the main body and would provide an alternative route into Moosburg if the direct approach proved too costly. Lieutenant Colonel Lann commanded the main force, while Major Alton S. Kircher, the battalion operations officer, led the flanking element. The attack was made without artillery preparation. Under normal circumstances, the 500th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion would have plastered the German positions with high-explosive shells before the armour advanced. Artillery preparation was standard doctrine, designed to suppress defensive fire, destroy prepared positions, and shock the defenders into disorganization before the assault elements closed with them. The American advantage in artillery was one of the most significant factors in the European campaign, and commanders had learned to use it ruthlessly whenever possible. But the presence of 110,000 Allied prisoners in the immediate area changed the calculation entirely. Artillery shells do not discriminate between friend and foe. A round that fell short or wandered off target could kill American and British soldiers just as easily as German defenders. The prison camp lay directly behind the German defensive positions, in the path that stray rounds would travel if the artillery overshot its targets. The risk of friendly fire casualties among the prisoners was unacceptable. The tankers and infantry would have to take Moosburg with direct fire weapons only, engaging targets they could see and identify rather than blanketing areas with explosive fire. German defenders along the route had no time to process the speed of the American advance. The main force pushed forward along the road without meeting any organized resistance for the first mile. German soldiers in isolated positions watched the column of Shermans roll past, too stunned by the sudden appearance of American armor to react effectively. Some fired scattered shots that pinged harmlessly off the tanks' hulls. Others threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Most simply watched in shock as the Americans drove by without slowing. The column reached a point approximately 1 mile northwest of Moosburg, where the road crossed the Amper River. Here, on the eastern bank, the SS had decided to make their stand. The first Sherman tank to move onto the bridge came under immediate and intense small arms fire from SS troops dug in along the riverbank. Bullets sparked off the tank's armor and ricocheted from the bridge's structure. The infantry riding on the tank's deck dove for cover behind the vehicle's bulk, pressing themselves against the armor as machine gun fire swept the bridge. The rest of the column deployed rapidly along the western bank, tanks maneuvering into firing positions, while infantry spread out to return fire against the muzzle flashes visible on the far side. Several infantrymen on the bridge were wounded in the initial exchange, caught in the open before they could find cover. Their comrades dragged them back along the bridge deck, exposed to continuing fire, until they could be passed to medics waiting in the relative safety of the western bank. After the wounded were evacuated, the American tanks and infantry surged forward into the engagement. The SS fought from prepared positions in the fields leading toward Moosburg and from behind a railroad embankment on the American left flank. The embankment was a formidable position, perhaps 500 yards from the bridge, running on a direct line between the river crossing and the prison camp. It provided excellent cover against direct fire, and the SS troops behind it could engage the Americans crossing the bridge without exposing themselves to tank main guns. If the position held, it could pin down the American advance, while other German forces completed whatever plans they had for Moosburg and the prisoners. Resistance was stiff. The SS troops fought with the fanaticism their reputation promised, holding their positions and pouring fire into the American advance, even as tanks maneuvered against them. They had no armor of their own, no anti-tank guns capable of stopping a Sherman at range. They were armed with small arms, machine guns, mortars, and Panzerfausts. But they used those weapons with the desperate skill of men who had nothing left to lose, and for a few minutes the outcome seemed uncertain. The battle-hardened Americans of the 47th Tank Battalion had faced worse. They had crossed France under fire. They had fought through the Siegfried Line. They had liberated camps before, and knew what might happen to the prisoners if the Germans were given time to implement whatever final orders Berlin had issued. They did not hesitate. Tank main guns fired at point-blank range into the SS positions, the 75mm rounds detonating among the foxholes and sending debris flying across the field. Coaxial machine guns swept the open ground, cutting down any German who showed himself. Infantry worked forward under the covering fire of the armor, moving from cover to cover, engaging individual enemy positions with rifle fire and grenades. The tankers and infantry operated with the coordination that months of combat together had produced, each element supporting the other, closing with the enemy with relentless aggression. All the while, American fire suppressed the SS troops on the railroad embankment, preventing them from bringing effective flanking fire to bear on the main assault. German soldiers who raised their heads above the embankment to fire on the advancing Americans drew immediate return fire from multiple tanks. The suppression was not perfect. Bullets still cracked overhead, but it was enough to degrade the German fire and allow the American infantry to continue their advance. By 10:30 in the morning, it was over. German survivors of the engagement would later describe the American attack as overwhelming, unstoppable, conducted with a speed and violence that gave defenders no opportunity to regroup or organize effective resistance. The SS lay dead in their foxholes, victims of their own decision to fight rather than surrender. Others stood with their hands raised, filed toward the rear as prisoners, stripped of the arrogance that SS membership had once provided. The road to Moosburg was open. Colonel Good and Group Captain Willits had arrived back at the prison camp shortly before the engagement at the Amper River Bridge. They gathered the senior officers from each national contingent and briefed them on what they had seen and heard. An American armored unit was coming to liberate the camp. German resistance was expected to be light, given the condition of the forces in the area. But until the fighting stopped, every prisoner should keep his head down and avoid doing anything that might draw fire. The prisoners and their German guards watched together as SS troops took up defensive positions in the fields beyond the camp perimeter. There was a strange tension in the camp. guards and prisoners alike, knowing that the moment of decision was approaching. Some guards quietly approached prisoners they had treated relatively well, asking whether the Americans might be told that this particular guard had been decent. Others gripped their weapons nervously, uncertain whether they were about to fight the approaching enemy or simply surrender and hope for the best. Then the sounds of battle reached them. The distinctive bark of American tank guns, the ripping sound of German machine guns answering, the sharper crack of small arms fire from both sides. Fire aimed at the SS positions on the railroad embankment inevitably passed over the defenders and into the camp itself. Prisoners and guards alike scrambled for cover, diving into ditches, pressing themselves against buildings, crouching behind anything that might stop a stray bullet. The irony was bitter, surviving years of captivity only to be killed by friendly fire in the last hours before liberation. Then came a massive explosion from the direction of the river. The bridge over the Isar had been destroyed, the Germans' final effort to slow the American advance into southern Bavaria. The demolition charges sent a column of smoke and debris into the air visible for miles. The physical manifestation of a barrier meant to stop the inexorable Allied advance. As quickly as it had begun, the intensity of the firing diminished. Scattered shots continued from the direction of the river, the sounds of mopping up rather than major combat. The prisoners waited, hearts pounding, straining to hear what would come next. The tanks of C Company and their supporting infantry wasted no time celebrating their victory at the Amper River. They raced through the streets of Moosburg at 20 miles per hour, a speed that would have seemed reckless anywhere else but reflected the urgent need to reach the river crossing before the Germans could destroy it and to secure the prison camp before anything could happen to the prisoners. German soldiers who had been preparing to defend the town simply watched the American armor roar past, too stunned by the speed of events to organize resistance. Many threw down their weapons and raised their hands without being asked. Others stood frozen as the Shermans rolled by without slowing, unable to process that the battle for their town was already over before it began. The lead element reached the bridge across the Isar within minutes of breaking through the defensive perimeter. As they approached, German defenders on the far bank opened fire with small arms and machine guns, a desperate effort to keep the Americans from seizing the span before it could be destroyed. The infantry dismounted and returned fire while the lead tank rolled onto the bridge. The Germans had prepared for this moment. Demolition charges had been placed throughout the bridge structure, their wires running back to a detonation point on the far bank, where observers waited for the optimal moment to blow the span. That moment came when the lead Sherman was fully committed to the crossing, its 32 tons committed to a structure that German engineers were about to destroy. The center of the bridge disappeared in a massive explosion. Stone and steel erupted upward, suspended for an instant against the Bavarian sky, then tumbled into the Isar below. The section of the span beneath the tank began tilting precariously toward the water, the structural supports destroyed, gravity beginning to claim what remained. What happened next would become one of those small legends that tankers told each other, the kind of skill under pressure that separated veterans from novices and survivors from casualties. The driver of the 32-ton Sherman, his tank sliding toward the river on a collapsing bridge with German fire still cracking around him, did not freeze. He did not hesitate. He did not consider bailing out and hoping for the best. He brought his vehicle to a halt on the tilting span, slammed the transmission into reverse, and gunned the engine. The tank's treads bit into the bridge surface, spinning, seeking purchase on material that was already beginning to fall. The vehicle lurched backward, climbing the incline that the collapsing section had created. For a long moment it seemed the tank would slide into the river despite everything the driver could do. Then the treads found solid purchase on the portion of the bridge still connected to the shore. The Sherman clawed its way backward off the tilting span and onto firm ground. Behind it, the ruined section of the bridge tumbled into the Isar with a crash that sent spray flying 50 feet into the air. Combat Command A had failed in its primary mission. The Isar River crossing was gone, but Brigadier General Karlstad, entering Moosburg with the main body of his force, was already focused on what could still be accomplished. German prisoners were being rounded up by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Lieutenant Colonel Land's tank and infantry platoons swept through the town, accepting surrenders faster than they could process them. Many Germans were eager to surrender to American forces, knowing their treatment would be better than whatever awaited them if they continued fighting or fell into Soviet hands. Others simply recognized that continued resistance was pointless. Among the captured was a large group that identified themselves as the guard force of the prison camp. Karlstad and his staff questioned several German officers about the camp's layout, the disposition of the remaining guards, and the condition of the prisoners, then selected a German captain to serve as a guide. What followed was one of the most audacious small unit actions of the entire European campaign, the kind of bold improvisation that no training manual could anticipate and no enemy could prepare to counter. Brigadier General Karlstad's party consisted of exactly 5 Americans. There was Karlstad himself, a one-star general commanding a force of 1,700 men, about to drive into a prisoner-of-war camp whose German garrison had not yet surrendered. There was Second Lieutenant Hodges, his aide, a junior officer whose job was supposed to involve paperwork and scheduling, not combat assaults. There was First Lieutenant Joseph P. Luby of the 68th Armored Infantry Battalion, an infantry officer who had survived the ambush at Mauern the night before and was about to demonstrate why the infantry branch produced some of the most audacious leaders in the American Army. And there were 3 drivers, enlisted men whose names history has not preserved, but whose courage matched that of their officers. They had 3 jeeps. One jeep mounted a single 30-caliber machine gun. That was the extent of their firepower. A submachine gun or 2, sidearms, nothing that could stand against a determined defense by armed men in prepared positions. Guided by the German captain, this tiny convoy drove across Moosburg toward the prison camp. The streets were chaotic. German soldiers milling about in confusion, American tanks occasionally visible in the distance. The sounds of the bridge demolition still echoing off the buildings. Nobody tried to stop them. As they approached the main gate of Stalag VII-A, they encountered a sight that would have given pause to a much larger force. The outer yard of the camp was filled with German soldiers, armed German soldiers, 240 of them, the camp's guard force, still carrying their rifles and submachine guns. They had not surrendered. They had not laid down their weapons. They were standing in formation, apparently waiting for orders that had not come, uncertain whether to fight, flee, or submit. First Lieutenant Luby made an instant decision that would define the moment and his career. Without slowing his vehicle, without showing any hesitation that might suggest vulnerability or doubt, he drove directly into the middle of the German formation. He brought his jeep to a sudden halt, both hands on the 30-caliber machine gun, and shouted a single word that every German soldier understood. Achtung! The German guards froze. 240 armed men stared at a single American lieutenant manning a machine gun on a jeep, surrounded by 4 other Americans in 2 additional vehicles. The mathematics were absurd. The Germans had rifles. The Germans had submachine guns. The Germans had grenades. 5 men, no matter how brave, cannot overpower 240 armed soldiers if those soldiers choose to fight. But the mathematics did not account for what had happened that morning. The mathematics did not include the sound of American tanks in Moosburg streets. The mathematics did not factor in the SS troops who had fought and died and surrendered at the Amper River Bridge. The mathematics could not calculate the psychological impact of watching your supposedly impregnable defensive positions collapse in less than 2 hours. And the mathematics could not measure American audacity, the willingness of 5 men to drive into the middle of an armed formation and act as if they owned the place. Lieutenant Luby ordered the Germans to line up and drop their weapons in front of them. They complied. 240 rifles, pistols, and submachine guns clattered to the ground. The camp guard force of Germany's largest prisoner-of-war facility surrendered to 5 Americans with 1 machine gun. The 5 men moved down the line, collecting officers' pistol belts and conducting quick searches for hidden weapons. They encountered no resistance. Moments later, a battle-scarred M4 Sherman rumbled up to the main gate, its armor marked by the scars of a dozen engagements, its crew watching the scene with expressions that mixed disbelief and admiration. More tanks followed, infantry riding on their hulls. Combat Command A was arriving in force, but the critical moment had already passed. 5 men had accomplished what an entire battalion might have struggled to achieve. Brigadier General Karlstad called for the German camp commandant, a colonel named Otto Berger, and received the unconditional surrender of the garrison and the camp. The formalities were brief. There was nothing left to negotiate. Group Captain Willits and Colonel Good were the first Allied prisoners to present themselves to their liberators. The 2 men who had risked their lives travelling through German lines to deliver a truce proposal that morning now stood in freedom, their long captivity finally at an end. Good and Karlstad embraced. 2 old friends reunited in circumstances neither could have imagined when they last served together before the war. Then, in a moment that would be remembered by every witness, an enterprising American soldier produced a United States flag. Where he had obtained it, in the middle of Bavaria, hundreds of miles from the nearest American supply depot, deep in what had been enemy territory until hours earlier, perhaps only he ever knew. Some soldiers carried flags through the entire war, waiting for the right moment to display them. Others acquired them through means that were better not examined too closely. However, this particular flag had come to be in Moosburg on that particular morning. Its appearance was perfect. The soldier ran the flag to the top of the camp flagpole, hauling down whatever German banner had flown there, replacing the symbol of their captivity with the symbol of their deliverance. The prisoners of Stalag VII-A, men who had endured months and years of captivity, who had survived on starvation rations, who had marched across frozen Germany as the Reich collapsed around them, who had wondered if this day would ever come, watched the stars and stripes climb into the Bavarian sky. The cheering was thunderous. 110,000 men from more than a dozen nations roared their joy and relief. The sound rolled across the camp, echoed off the buildings, carried across the fields where SS troops had died, defending positions that could not be defended. German guards who had expected the day to end in combat or a negotiated withdrawal stood in formation as prisoners themselves, watching their former captives celebrate with an intensity that defied description. The reversal was complete. The hunters had become the hunted, the jailers had become the jailed, and the Americans, who German propaganda had dismissed for years as soft, undisciplined, incapable of matching the warrior spirit of the Reich, had proven once again that they could move faster, hit harder, and think bolder than anything the German military could counter. As the reality of liberation sank in, scenes of wild celebration erupted throughout the camp. American tanks crashed through the double 10-foot wire fences that had enclosed the prisoners, the steel mesh that had defined the boundaries of their world for months or years parting like tissue paper before the Sherman's bulk. Men of every nation poured through the gaps to greet their liberators. Norwegians who had been captured in the defense of their homeland, Brazilians from the expeditionary force that had fought in Italy, French soldiers taken in 1940 who had spent 5 years behind German wire, Poles who had fought in every theatre and suffered more than any other Allied nation, Dutch, Greeks, Romanians, Bulgarians, Americans who had been captured from Kasserine to Normandy to the Bulge, Russians whose treatment by the Germans had been worst of all, Serbs, Italians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Australians, British, Canadians, men from every nation fighting the Reich, gathered in this one place, now free together. Officers and enlisted men, 27 Red Army generals, the sons of 4 American generals, young men whose family names had marked them for special attention from their captors, soldiers, sailors, and airmen from every branch of service, war correspondents, and radio men who had been captured while covering the conflict. They surrounded the American vehicles. So many men flowed over and around the tanks, jeeps, and half-tracks that the vehicles completely disappeared beneath masses of jubilant humanity. A 6'4" Australian threw his arms around a jeep driver and shouted, "You damned bloody Yanks, I love you." A weary American paratrooper with a beard grown during months of captivity climbed onto a tank and kissed the tank commander, tears streaming down his face, unable to find words for what he felt. Italians and Serbs, exhausted and drawn, pressed forward to touch their liberators, weeping with relief and joy. An Army Air Forces lieutenant kissed the hull of a Sherman tank, pressed his lips against the cold steel that had brought him freedom. "God damn," he said. "Do I love the ground forces?" Among the liberated were soldiers of the 14th Armored Division itself, men who had been listed as missing in action since mid-November, when the division first entered combat, stood blinking in the sunlight, scarcely believing their comrades had found them. They had been captured in the brutal fighting of autumn and winter, held through the coldest months of the war, sustained only by hope that their division was still out there, still fighting, still coming for them. Now that hope was fulfilled, the tankers of C Company were thrilled to discover 8 of their own, crewmen who had been captured in January when their tanks were knocked out in the fighting around Herleshheim. They had wondered for months whether their friends were alive or dead. Now, they knew. Technician 5th grade Floyd G. Mahoney of C Company experienced a different kind of reunion entirely. Among the thousands of liberated prisoners was his own son, an Army Air Forces lieutenant shot down over Germany. Father and son embraced amid the chaos of liberation. A moment of personal joy within the larger triumph, a family reunited by the chance of war that had brought a tank crewman's unit to the camp where his pilot son was held. Most of the American soldiers who fought at Moosburg never actually saw the prison camp. They did not have time to join the celebrations or reflect on what they had accomplished. That afternoon, the infantry of B Company, 68th Armored Infantry Battalion, crossed the Isar on a footbridge, hastily constructed by the engineers, and began patrolling the far bank. They took additional casualties from sporadic German fire, including mortars, self-propelled guns, and artillery from German units that had not yet received word that continued resistance was pointless. The rest of Combat Command A established a defensive perimeter around Moosburg and began the enormous task of processing the thousands of German prisoners who had been trapped in the area when the bridge was destroyed. Even Major General Smith, the division commander, participated in the roundup. Early that afternoon, he arrived at the Combat Command, a command post in Moosburg, with an unexpected passenger riding on the hood of his jeep, an SS major, captured personally by the commanding general. In one of those strange coincidences that war produces, it was the same SS major who had carried the truce proposal to Combat Command A headquarters that morning. He had expected to negotiate an armistice that would buy time for German forces to escape. Instead, he ended the day as a prisoner of the very Americans whose advance he had tried to stop. Word of the liberation spread rapidly through Allied command channels. Within hours, Lieutenant General George S. Patton himself arrived at Stalag VII-A with an entourage of senior officers. Patton, whose Third Army had driven deeper into Germany faster than any force in military history, walked among the liberated prisoners and spoke with men who had endured captivity while his army fought to free them. For the prisoners, seeing Patton in person, the legendary commander whose very name had become synonymous with American armored warfare, confirmed what the arrival of the tanks had promised. They were truly free. The war, for them, was over. Combat Command B closed on Moosburg that afternoon, accompanied by elements of the 395th Infantry Regiment of the 99th Infantry Division. That night, they crossed the Isar on a bridge constructed by C Company of the 125th Armoured Engineer Battalion and the 998th Treadway Bridge Company. American engineering had replaced in hours what German demolitions had destroyed. Tanks and endless columns of infantry moved across the new bridge and deeper into Germany. Behind them, the war was over. Ahead, in its final days, combat continued. For the soldiers of the 14th Armoured Division, there was more fighting, more liberating, and some dying still to be done. Combat Command A had failed in its assigned mission to capture the Isar River Bridge intact. By conventional military standards, by the measures that staff officers use to evaluate operations, the attack on Moosburg might have been judged a partial success at best. The bridge was gone. The Germans had achieved their immediate tactical objective of denying the crossing. The American advance was delayed while engineers built a replacement, but the conventional standards were overwhelmed by what Combat Command A had actually accomplished in those hours between dawn and noon. The liberation of Stalag VII-A freed 110,000 Allied prisoners of war. Not 27,000, as initial reports to the press stated, but 110,000, the largest single liberation in the European theatre. 30,000 of those prisoners were Americans, soldiers and sailors and airmen who had waited behind German wire for the day that had finally come. The psychological impact on Allied forces and on the crumbling German Reich was incalculable. The physical impact, 110,000 trained soldiers returned to their home countries, was enormous. The moral impact, demonstrating that the Allies would fight to free their captured men, reinforced the bonds that held the coalition together. In the final accounting, 1,750 Americans of Combat Command A, 14th Armored Division, operating with only one company of infantry, had covered 50 miles in a single day. They had rejected a German truce proposal within minutes of receiving it, refusing to give the enemy even an hour of additional time. They had broken through SS defensive positions in less than 2 hours. They had liberated the largest prisoner of war camp in Germany before noon. They had captured thousands of German soldiers, including the entire guard force of the camp. They had done all of this while losing only a handful of men to enemy action. 5 Americans with 1 machine gun had accepted the surrender of 240 armed Germans without firing a shot. A tank driver on a collapsing bridge had backed his 32-ton Sherman to safety while the span tumbled into the river behind him, a feat of skill and nerve that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not spent months learning exactly what his vehicle could do. A brigadier general had led the attack from the front, driving into an enemy-held town in a jeep to personally accept the camp's surrender, demonstrating the kind of leadership that inspired men to follow wherever their commanders led. German officers who reviewed the events of April 29, 1945, struggled to explain how it had happened. Their defensive preparations had been sound by the standards of German doctrine. Their troop dispositions had been reasonable given the forces available. Their truce proposal had been logical, offering both sides a way to avoid unnecessary casualties, while the larger strategic situation resolved itself. Every calculation had made sense within the framework of military theory as they understood it. But American commanders did not operate within German military theory. They did not pause to consider proposals when attack was possible. They did not slow down to consolidate gains when momentum could be maintained. They did not wait for reinforcements when the forces at hand were sufficient for audacious action. They attacked, and they kept attacking, and they moved with a speed that German defenders simply could not match. The SS troops who had prepared to defend the Amper River crossing expected an attack that would develop over hours, with artillery preparation, infantry probes, and the careful build-up that German doctrine prescribed. That would have given them time to inflict casualties, perhaps withdraw to secondary positions, perhaps call for reinforcements. Instead, American armor was through their lines and racing into Moosburg before they fully understood the assault had begun. The German officers who proposed the truce expected negotiations that might last days, time for higher headquarters to weigh in, time for diplomats to become involved, time for the military situation to evolve. Instead, their proposal was rejected in minutes, and American tanks were attacking before the delegation even returned to Moosburg. The camp guards who stood in the outer yard with their weapons expected that any approaching enemy would proceed with overwhelming force and appropriate caution against armed resistance. Instead, 5 Americans drove into their midst as if the 240 rifles surrounding them were irrelevant. And in that moment, through the alchemy of audacity and psychological shock, the rifles were irrelevant. The war in Europe had taught many lessons about American capabilities, but perhaps none more clearly than the liberation of Stalag VII-A. Speed, aggression, individual initiative, and the willingness to take calculated risks had become the defining characteristics of American armored operations. German forces could prepare defensive positions, could plan counterattacks, could develop tactical responses to specific American capabilities. What they could not do was match the tempo of American operations or predict what American commanders would dare to attempt. When the tanks of the 47th Tank Battalion broke through the wire fences of Stalag VII-A, they were writing the final chapter of that lesson. American armor did not wait for conditions to become favorable. American commanders did not hesitate when opportunity presented itself. American soldiers did not stop to calculate the odds before acting. 5 men with 1 machine gun looked at 240 armed Germans and saw a problem that could be solved with sufficient audacity. A tank driver on a collapsing bridge saw a problem that could be solved with sufficient skill. A brigadier general leading from the front saw a problem that could be solved with sufficient speed. The Germans, in those final days of the war, had no answer for any of it. 110,000 Allied prisoners walked out of Stalag VII-A into freedom, because 1,750 Americans decided that no German defensive position, no truce proposal, no river crossing would slow them down. They had a mission. They had the means to accomplish it. Hit subscribe if you want the next one, like if this one earned it. The comments here are full of veterans' families sharing their own stories, historians catching details I missed, and people discovering this history for the first time. Add your voice. I'll see you in the next video.